Jesse, did they change your name? So you all know who I am. Oh, Jesse, where are you, darling son? You were taken from my arms.
To the mothers whose babies were taken and hidden from them, and who were misled, deceived, threatened, or forced to relinquish their babies, we say sorry. And we're committed to ensuring these policies and practices are not forgotten and are never repeated. To all those affected, we say sorry.
Till they came to put me out. I had to fight.
We say sorry to you, the mothers, who were denied knowledge of your rights, which meant you could not provide informed consent. You were given false assurances. You were forced to endure the coercion and brutality of practices that were unethical, dishonest, and in many cases illegal.
You were taken from my arms.
When I consented to the adoption, it wasn't as though I'd made a decision myself. There didn't appear to be any other options available. From the moment that my mother realised I was pregnant, the only discussions I can recall are about adoption and what was to be done with me until it was all over. And in the time that I was pregnant, I can't recall my father having any discussion with me about it at all. So there was this silence that started and continued. And along with that was this incredible feelings of shame and guilt that were there. They were real. I felt shame for what I had done and shame for what I'd brought on my parents, and so that shame just seemingly sucked any resistance out of me. I don't recall fighting or arguing. I'm sure I did. I'm sure there were times that there wasn't silence, but in the main, I recall silence. And so I accepted that I was guilty and that there was shame, and there was no other options. There were no options available or no information available about any options. So that's, and the implication also was that if I did this thing, that my life could go on as normal and I would still be part of a family, and I could get on with my life, and I was definitely doing the best thing for my child. So they're all pretty coercive tactics to use on a 19-year-old who has no alternate information. So in that way, there was just enormous pressure for me to comply. So, consent. After the adoption, I can recall just feeling hollowed out. I had no sense of myself or my life or anything. And again, the silence continued. Nobody wanted to talk about it. I was expected to get on with my life, and so I did. And so there was no shoulder to cry on. There's no opportunity to grieve. And so life continued, and I almost felt like I was always operating two lives. There was one where I continued to do all the normal things, got on, went to work, saved money, went overseas, had a normal life. And there was another life inside my head and my heart that the chattering was going on and the constant wondering about what had happened to my daughter, whether she was well, whether she was even alive, because there was just that silence. And the other thought that I clung to always, which was the thought that maintained your sort of sanity or your reasonableness with dealing with the world, was that I had done the very best thing I could for my daughter. I had given her an opportunity, I believe, for a decent life. The flip side of that was that I was acknowledging again and again and again my inadequacies of being a mother and the guilt that I had abandoned her. So life went on. I've been very fortunate. I've been in a very good relationship with a wonderful supportive partner for years and years. But I never had another child, and that was a conscious decision. I could only see that as a betrayal of my daughter, that she was abandoned and another child might be nurtured. And should I ever meet her, I would never have been able to explain to her or deal with any anguish she might have from that distinction. So it was to be, no children. My daughter contacted me in 2007, and I had always hoped that I would meet her, or at least have news of her one day. But I had never tried to trace her myself. And that was also coming from these terrible beliefs I had inside of me that I had no rights, and I certainly was probably unworthy. I had no right to intrude in another person's life, particularly if she was happy, and I couldn't thrust myself on her after all that time. So this incredibly generous person contacted me to tell me that she was well and happy, and it was a relief and a joy. And I was terrified. She is a wonderful person, so proud to know her. But I was overwhelmed when I met her of the sense of connection that I felt immediately. I was completely blindsided by it because this was an adult person I was meeting who I had only ever glimpsed as a tiny infant. And I felt so close to her, and I didn't know anything about her. And the other overwhelming thing was the grief that came out. I wasn't ready for it, I didn't expect it, but all those things came to the surface, the shame and the guilt and the confusion, and it was all just grief. But it's just been the most wonderful experience to be reunited with my daughter. It's so complicated and challenging and frustrating. I get so frustrated because of our lack of shared history. I get selfish and I want just her with plenty of time to connect and catch up. But that doesn't happen because she's a busy woman, she's a busy mother, she has a wonderful career, she has a wonderful family, and life has to go on. So I guess we don't have regular contact, we have random contact. She lives in another state, and I guess I just try to keep her aware that I'm just still there and I'm not going anywhere. For me, the apology didn't seem to have much relevance. The apologies may mean a lot of other different things, particularly with mothers who were treated abominably, but it still doesn't mean much to me because it doesn't change anything. It can't go back to the past, and it certainly doesn't wipe out the pain that's been caused. And I guess the only positive that I can see, the only positive result, is that in acknowledging the responsibility, that there's been funding made available. There's been funding made available to try to affect that healing process for everybody concerned. It's outside the adoptive community. I don't think that people get it. And in a way, I think that that's a defence mechanism too, because people shy away from pain and they shy away from people in pain. They don't want to understand it because they might become involved in it. So I think it's a really hard ask to get people to understand the effect that the adoption process has had on everybody involved in it, when the process is just all about pain.
I was adopted in 1971 and I was born at the Royal Brisbane Hospital, and I stayed there for 3 weeks after I was born. My mother and I didn't see or touch each other, and 3 weeks after I was born, my new adoptive family came and picked me up, and they had 3 existing biological children. So for me, growing up adopted, one of the biggest things was that there was this hall of mirrors around me, because they all looked like each other, sounded like each other, could finish each other's sentences, and I felt very separate from that. And no matter how I tried to sort of penetrate that fabric of the family, even though they loved me and I loved them, I always felt quite separate from it. One great thing about my parents is that they don't believe in having secrets in the family. So from when I was a baby, they told me that I was adopted. And they used to tell me that I was their darling adopted daughter. And sort of as I got older, I would ask them questions, what does adopted mean? And they would sort of patiently explain it. And it wasn't until I was about 5 that the penny finally dropped, that I hadn't been in my mother's stomach and that I had a different story to my siblings. And one of the things that they used to tell me when I would ask about adoption was that I had another mother, that she loved me very much, but she couldn't look after me. So she'd given me to another family who could look after me. And so I guess in my head, I started to equate love with abandonment. So even though someone loved me very much, they gave me away. So I was always very terrified that my adoptive family would also give me away. And so love and abandonment sort of became 2 things that were similar in my head. And I think I was 13 years old before I first stayed away from home without my parents, or at least my brother, with me. And I was happy to stay away if my brother was with me, because I knew that he was theirs and they would come back for him. But I was frightened that they wouldn't come back for me. So I think growing up adopted, it was just confusing. I wasn't given any discussion on having lost anything. It was all about what I gained by having my family. No one ever discussed adoption as though anything bad had happened. I was just like this mystery. One thing that I was told as I was growing up is that I would never be able to meet my birth family, because I was born during the closed adoption system, where all of those records were sealed. So I was told I'd never know their name and I'd never be able to find them. And that was really heartbreaking for me, because from the earliest of age, the one thing I knew is that I really wanted to find them and meet them and see them and find someone that looked like me. I would say as an adult, the single biggest effect was when I had both of my sons. So when I had my first son, I was 28, 29 years old. And I felt like I went into shock when I had him because I was just suddenly there with this baby. He was crying, for 50 minutes straight when he came out. And I just felt really confused and strange and very disassociated. And I look back now and I think probably it triggered some of my own traumatic experiences, which I had not come to terms with at that time. And it probably took me a good 2 years to feel like I had bonded with him. And nobody was sort of around to tell me that adoption might have had something to do with that. And then when I had my second son, which was 8.5 years later, it was a different experience. It was much better. But while I was pregnant with him, I had always, I'd not really understood in my own head how I could miss something I never knew. So how I could miss my mother, and I'd felt that keenly when I was growing up. There was times I felt so heartsick and homesick for her, but I never had met her, I'd never known her, so how could I miss something I'd never had? But when I was pregnant with my second son, whenever my 8-year-old son would come around and talk near me, my son in my stomach would just go crazy. He would kick and move, and I would actually have to ask my eldest son to move away sometimes because of how much he moved. And it just really reiterated with me that my son in my stomach was totally bonded to my son and to my voice and to my husband's voice. And of course he was going to miss that when he came out if it wasn't there, if suddenly those things were taken away. How could he not miss it? Because he'd already bonded with all of those voices and feelings and just the DNA of who we were. The other thing that's sort of happening in my life at the moment is that my adoptive father has heart failure. He's in the hospital right now. And over the last few years, as we've been preparing for what seems to keep going, but will be an inevitable end for him. The loss of my adoptive parents is bringing up feelings of abandonment for me again. It's like this ultimate and, of course, abandonment because eventually they leave. So I do find that the last few years have been quite difficult. I always wanted to meet my birth mother from the youngest of age. I thought I couldn't, so I kind of put it aside. But when I was 19 years old, I was in the kitchen and I was doing the dishes with my dad, shoulder to shoulder with my dad, and I heard on the news that they just passed new legislation that opened up records and that would allow me to meet my mother if she had not put a veto on it. And to say I was in a rush to do that would be an understatement because, of course, suddenly I was allowed to have access to her and I wanted to. So I went through a counsellor, I think it was back then, and she was somebody who contacted my birth mother on my behalf. We exchanged one letter and then we very quickly met, and probably too quickly, because I sort of felt like I was in shock again when I had that meeting. And while I was and continue to be extremely grateful that she was able to and willing to meet me. The relationship has had its ups and downs, but I'm never sorry that I did it. It's something I had to do. And it was 20 years later when I met my father. So I didn't think he would be interested in meeting me, so that's why I waited so long, because I don't think there is anything scarier in life than an adoptee looking into that black abyss of wanting to meet their parents and not knowing what they're going to find, whether they'll be interested in meeting them. You go in there with your heart completely exposed and you just don't know what you'll find. But I found with both my parents, people who are willing to be a part of my family, who were going through their own trauma and shame as well, which made those relationships difficult, but they were willing to meet me, and that was everything. It was everything for me to meet them. I would like for people to understand about adoption is that it is lifelong issues. It's not always a good story, and I think that I've been told by people over the years that oh, you must have had a bad story because you've got some issues with adoption. Whereas, I know somebody and they're completely happy with everything and they have no issues and no desire to meet people. And I think I would say you don't know what a person affected by adoption is thinking, because it's very unlikely they're going to be very open with you about it, because we so often get bad feedback when we are open about our experience that we don't often do that. And not only that, how we feel about adoption changes over the years. So what I would have said about adoption when I was 12 compared to 19 compared to 39 compared to now, it changes. Just as life changes and experiences have effect on you, you meet people, you have children, and different issues come up at different times. So don't assume that you know what the adopted person or mother or father in your life knows about adoption. And it is lifelong. It's something that will recede and come to the fore in your life at different times. When the Queenslander National Apologies for Forced Adoption happened, I didn't attend them, and I didn't take a huge interest because I didn't think I was a forced adoption, because when I met my birth mother, she said to me that she had not been coerced and had not been forced or drugged as had happened to some women at the time. So I took it upon myself to think that I was not a forced adoption. But hindsight, looking back, I now realise that she was an 18-year-old girl at the time that she had me. Her parents had kicked her out of the house. She'd come to Brisbane chasing down my father and had got nowhere with that. And she even made a last-ditch attempt when she was in the hospital to contact my father's family, and they said they didn't want anything to do with her. So what choice did she have? She had no choice. So while I didn't interact with the Queensland and the federal apologies at the time, a few years later I went along to an anniversary event, and it was there that I sort of discovered those things and thought about it differently, and thought, of course it was a forced adoption, because there were no other options available to her. And it sort of hit me in a big way at that time, and I was so grateful that there are anniversaries for these things, because not everyone's going to come to the apologies at the time they're given, and coming to it later through an anniversary event is really important, because then you can understand it and it will have more meaning for you.
Leading up to the birth of my son, everybody had coerced us into a situation where the best course of action would be to give our son away for adoption. And that coercion was extremely strong. And by the time the birth came, we felt as though there was no choice. That choice was taken away. So, in the short call, I agreed to the adoption, but in reality, I was pushed to the point where I had no choice. Strangely enough, it was easier at the time because of all the coercion that we'd had, and people pushing us in that direction sort of almost prepared us for the final decision. But after the decision was made, that all went away. We had no support. So the 12 months after left us very empty and very angry, let down, mistrusting. As life went on, the regret got stronger, probably for 20 years, and then a strong urge to make contact. As a result of what went on in the early days, I've just experienced extreme distrust for people in authority, and found it very difficult to make relationships comfortable. I had looked for my son for many years, probably not with all the resources that were available, but I often heard stories about adopted people and asked them what their birthday was. And eventually the laws were changed in the late 90s where there was contact allowed between adopted children and their parents, provided both parties were willing. My son at the time was about 18, so I went and registered my willingness to make contact, and left a bit of medical information, and I was very much aware at 18 years old he probably wouldn't be interested in catching up with someone who claimed to be his father. So I just left a waiting contact message, and it took another 16 years, and eventually I got some broken messages through Facebook of all things, and through my sons, my other sons, and we were able to make contact eventually. It didn't happen straight away. We made an initial contact through Facebook, and then we wrote to each other with all our family histories and stories, and eventually we met. And it's been fantastic. So, yep. So, found my son and a couple of grandkids, and yeah, they've really changed my life. The apologies that were given, for me personally, didn't mean a lot. I felt that they probably weren't directed personally at me, and I think they were probably very good for some people. They may have been just what they needed. No apology can change what's happened. The connection between a father and his child, coming from a loving relationship, is as strong as it is between a mother and a child. It's certainly not maternal, but the pride and the love that a father has, and is the same as it is for a woman. So, and being a father, responsibility is a pretty major thing, and not being able to provide once the adoption is set, you can't fulfil those responsibilities. So then you're left in a position where you feel inadequate, that you failed.
Well, I'd like people to understand that forced adoption is a diverse range of impacts on people, and it's a diverse range of practices. So it covers everything from, illegal direct force to people just had no other choices because the cards were stacked against them in the deck. And whether it was family or government, they were forced to make a decision that otherwise they would not wish to. So there's a diverse range of experience. It's not one thing.
Forced adoption in this country was widespread, and it all the major hospitals and Catholic institutions and doctors and nurses and clergy played an active role in threatening and coercing mothers into giving their children up for adoption even though they didn't want to. So that's an important factor to know, that over 250,000 non-Indigenous children were removed by illegal and criminal practices here in Australia, and very few people understand that.
I think also I'd like people to understand that adoption was a system, so it's not all about personal decisions or what personal behaviours that people did to people. It was a systemic thing that forced people to be separated from their sons or daughters, and it wasn't just about individual choices and some people being nasty. It was a way we did things back in the past.
If a young girl fell pregnant without being married, she was virtually funneled into the adoption area, because if her partner had not supported her, or her parents didn't want her to bring the baby home, she was told that the only option for her was to have the baby adopted.
Society doesn't realise that in that day and age we were given absolutely no assistance. We weren't allowed to enter the hospital by the front door, we had to go through the back door. We weren't allowed to talk to anybody in the hospital. We were all taken in before we were due date, so we didn't have our babies anywhere but in the hospital. And that was to make sure that they had our babies to take, to give to other people.
Quite a few of us, and I think it's probably in the majority, when we did give birth, we were tied down to the bed. We had pillows placed over our faces so that we couldn't see us giving birth. And as soon as our babies were actually expelled, they were quickly taken from the room, and the only thing I saw of my daughter was just that she had black hair as they whisked her out of the room. And I think that was fairly common practice.
Most of the mothers were under 21, yet they were able to sign their babies away even though you had to be over 21 to legally do anything. So they basically would force, threaten, coerce the mothers, and for many, many, many years adoptees had no idea that their mothers had experienced that.
The results of that was that mothers left hospital without a baby in their arms, and they were told to just get on with your life and you will forget about this in 12 months and you'll get married and have children of your own. So that never happened. These mothers have been in grief for 50 odd years, and many of them, unfortunately, have died before they've found their child or have suicided because of the trauma that they've suffered from having a child whisked away at birth.
Society needs to learn and listen and take note of what happened to us and never, ever repeat the past practices of forced adoption, because they were not only illegal, they were cruel, they were inhumane, they were barbaric, and they caused masses of problems for us all.
And it's like people to understand that it's not suitable just to say, well, that's the way things were done, and not to think that people deserve an apology. Because in a similar era, there's the drug thalidomide was administered to pregnant women, and with tragic effects on sons and daughters there. And today, no one who was involved in those practices would not think of expressing sorrow or regret. So I think it's important to understand that the community does need to say, well, we won't do this again.
My support group got the world first hospital apology from the Royal Brisbane Women's Hospital. It was from that hospital apology that we got the Senate inquiry, and it was from the Senate inquiry that we got the federal government apology. We also lobbied to get a state government apology. So it meant a great deal to us at long last to have the trauma, the hurt, the heartache, and the pain, and the truth about forced adoption told to the general public.
I saw a lot of positive changes in people. I saw a burden lift from people when the apology was given, because up until that time, the individuals concerned, whether they were mothers, fathers or sons and daughters, felt that somehow or other it was their fault and they weren't being listened to. And I just sensed that when people acknowledged that a wrong was done, it lifted the burden of imposed guilt that society had put on people and said, no, it's not your fault. You don't need to feel that way. We don't do things that way now, and we apologise and are sorry for the past. So at a personal level, that was very significant.
And by doing that, adoptees and mothers could begin their healing process. It didn't heal it there and then, but by acknowledging it, making it open, letting the mothers know that they didn't do anything wrong, by letting adoptees know that they weren't discarded by their mothers, like as if they were just unwanted puppies or something, that the mothers fought for them and really loved them. That changed a lot for adoptees, because we had a lot of adoptees that felt very angry that they had been rejected, when in fact they weren't. They were very much loved. So knowing that really helped them in the healing process.
I would say around 50% said that it validated what they'd been telling their families, that they felt vindicated, that they always knew it was illegal to take a child from a mother when the mother was actually the guardian, the official guardian. Some of them said that their adopted, now adult children had come back to them and said, I'm sorry, I didn't believe you when you told me because it was just so unbelievable. But now, since Julia Gillard has said what she said, we do understand and we believe you. The other half probably were the ones who thought, well, okay, it was illegal, so if you do an illegal thing to any citizen of the country, there should be repercussions. So where was the compensation? Where were the people being charged who, in these some of these religious organisations, perpetrated these atrocities? And I think that's about half and half. So half of them were relieved and happy. The other half were, it hasn't gone far enough. We need to still look at our compensation because it was a criminal act that was perpetrated on us.
The lessons that we'd like the public and government to understand from former forced adoptions is that adoption is extremely traumatic and is lifelong and generational. So it doesn't just affect us, it affects our children and our grandchildren, because we lose not just our biological family but our entire culture and our heritage.
You know, the saying sorry for the past also means doing things differently in the future. And so adoption in the future, there should be less of it. What there is of it should be done differently. It should be more open, less secret, that parents should be supported not to separate from their children if possible.
I personally believe that adoption should be abolished. Adoption does not have a place in society today. We have other ways of protecting our children.
We all agree that in some cases families cannot be reunited for different reasons, and I think then a child deserves a nice safe home. But why do we have to go down the trial of adoption? Why can't we give them guardianship, which means that they stay with that family but they keep their name, they keep their original birth certificate, but they have a nice secure family to grow up in. But that also means that they still can have some contact with their extended family. Like a grandparent shouldn't lose a child because its parents have, not maintained that child properly. And in the case of adoption, it severs that whole connection to the original family.
Adoption was brought in to cover illegitimacy. We don't need this in Australia anymore. Nobody really cares about illegitimacy, and there's no need to worry about changing a child's last name. Over 50% of marriages break up A lot of kids in the family have last names that are quite different. You just need two loving people in a family who will take responsibility to love and care for this child and raise his child up in a permanent home, loving home, rather than to take ownership of the child by wiping out their entire identity, heritage and culture. That does more damage than anything.
Before a child needs assistance and help, usually a parent needs assistance and help. And as a community today, we are better geared to helping parents to maintain family connections. And those lessons have been learnt, unfortunately, through a lot of pain and anguish and trauma. And if we don't change policy and practice, then the apology will mean nothing in the end. But I think there are signs out there that everybody wants to do things differently and not to repeat the past.
The Senate and Community Inquiry was formed after years of action and advocacy and visitation by strong women. Mothers who'd been affected by forced adoptions had been visiting parliamentarians all around Australia, and in a couple of states, New South Wales in particular, and I think Tasmania, they'd had state inquiries on this issue, and they'd made reports, they'd made recommendations, and really not a lot had changed. When I was elected, we knew about it, but nothing was clearly on the agenda. In about 2010, I was visited by a group of women who were from Queensland, from the ALAS group, who came to talk to me as their senator and said, "This is what's happened to us," opened up their hearts and told me their story and said that they expected me, as their senator, to go back to Canberra and work towards an inquiry. And they'd done this all across the country, and out of that came the Senate inquiry. And it was set up to have a look at this topic of forced adoption, which most people had never heard about. It was a concept that in our country, at a period when some of us were alive, and certainly towards the end of the 70s, all the senators involved were alive at that time, women were actually treated so badly by their system. Hospitals, doctors, churches, families, all the system seemed to work together to actually separate women from their babies. And then the trauma that caused to so many people, which continues to this day, and I strongly believe that. There was an expectation that there would be a Senate inquiry. Terms of reference, it went out publicly. We had hundreds and hundreds of submissions from across the country, a number of public inquiries, a number of discussions and meetings and visits. It's all on Hansard record. It's all available, 2012. I think it's compulsory reading for people to see what happened in our country. I've been involved in many extraordinarily important and often traumatic inquiries, but none more so than this one. And from the time I met those strong women, and some of them are with us still, Trish and Marg and Jan and her wonderful artwork, there was a connection. And I think particularly for a woman, when you speak to women who, at their most vulnerable, very young, often alone, traumatised, and they told their stories and about what that meant to them at the time. That's made, I think, a permanent impact on me. This experience could so easily have been mine, and I think that made a permanent impact on me. I think another thing out of this inquiry has been, it's probably amongst all the work that I've done in the Senate, the inquiry that people come up and actually talk to me about. And they say, you know, my mum was one of those women, or I was adopted, and that inquiry meant something to me. This inquiry is important. It continues to be important to this day. It must not just rest on some library shelves, as so many things do, because the impact continues, because it's intergenerational. And the people who were impacted by the experience, they have all shared with me, the people with whom I've met, of course, that the experiences go from generation to a generation about love, about what families mean, about genuine connection. And I think that we need to keep that real. And so for me, this inquiry was an extraordinary experience, an honour to be part, and also a commitment to ensure that we don't make the same mistakes again, because as you know, in the series of apologies at the state level and at the federal level, there was a commitment that we would learn from this experience and we wouldn't make the same mistakes again. Mothers and fathers and grandparents wanted the children that were taken from them to know that they weren't given away. This was a concept of not an informed decision. In fact, that was the core element of the whole process, that this was not an informed, voluntary action, that this process was systemic and that these decisions were made without consent. So for many, it was just having that acknowledged. I think for people who came to talk with us who were adopted, they wanted to hear that message as well. But they wanted also to get some concept because of this search of wanting to know who they are, this sense of identity, which is so important for people. It was across the board an opportunity to acknowledge what had happened, to identify what the causes were. Why did this happen? And why did it happen in such large numbers across our country? Because it happened in every state and territory. There were people impacted, so it wasn't peculiar to one area. And what can we learn about it? And I think one of the things that is really important that came out of the inquiry was then funding was provided to the Australian Institute of Family Studies to do a study of past adoption practices in Australia. So there's a whole range of things that come out of it, but I think the fact that no longer are the stories hidden, no longer is guilt or fear or anger repressed, and that institutions and organisations that took part in this process have acknowledged that despite the motivation, what happened was wrong and should never happen again.
Well, I was appointed as the Minister for Communities, Child Safety and Disability Services in early 2012 after the election of the Newman government, and a few months later, I think it was in July, I had a meeting with some ladies from ALAS who came to talk to me about forced adoption practices and how that had impacted upon them. And I was aware in the background of the inquiry happening at a federal level around forced adoptions, but I really didn't understand it terribly well, having just come into the role. And so my conversations, firstly with the ladies from ALAS, and then further with other stakeholders who had been dreadfully and traumatically impacted by those policies and practices, really started the ball rolling in terms of getting an apology happening here in Queensland. Well, the most important thing that I learnt from, well, they're primarily mothers that I spoke to, was that they loved their children and that they were devastated that they did not have the opportunity to raise them, to love them, to care for them, to see them grow up because of the policies and practices. I also learnt that they were very strong and determined women who needed the community to know that they loved their children. And that they needed to be believed that those policies and practices actually did occur, because there was certainly a feeling that these young mothers, were not capable of looking after their children. Some were called terrible names. They were referred to as biker moles and unfit to care for children, terrible language used, when it was merely a consequence of these dreadful policies that were in place. But they wanted an apology, and they were dogged in their determination for that to happen, and I was happy to go with them on that journey. And I know that the then Premier Campbell Newman was very determined to see an apology happen here in Queensland, not because of what was happening from the Senate inquiry. That was important work that was being done, but it was because it was the right thing to do. Well, I hope that the Queensland apology provided for those directly impacted, a sense that they were believed, that their journey and this could have gone on for 40 or 50 years, for some women, that they were believed, that for those that had not yet had the opportunity to connect with their children were able to do that, to be able to have a dialogue with the community, that they understood that these families were broken before they even had the opportunity to start. And so I hope that it provided, particularly for the mothers and the children of forced adoption practices, some closure in terms of receiving an apology, but they'll never forget what happened. It's why it was so important to us to find a memento, a token that represented what this apology was about for here in Queensland. I'm wearing a little badge at the moment, and it's the T Rose. And what the T Rose stands for is that I will always remember you. And I can tell you from speaking to these mothers and fathers and children involved in those practices, they'll never forget and they will always remember. And I think that we need to make sure that the community always remembers the terrible practices of the past, the trauma that these families endured, and that we never ever go down that path again.